Assets. I am attorney David Meyer. If you have a 401k, an IRA, any kind of retirement account, or any savings at all invested in mutual funds, stocks, annuities, variable life insurance, you are an investor who's putting your faith in the U.S. stock market, so you need to be informed. The goal of my show here, Cover Your Assets, is to be the voice of the individual investor. Investment fraud is a huge problem in this country. Billions of dollars of investment savings for individual, everyday Americans is lost to investment fraud. It's something that not a lot of people like to talk about, so we're going to put a voice on behalf of the individual investor. I am David Meyer. I'm an investment fraud attorney, the founding partner of the law firm of Meyer Wilson. The investment fraud lawyers at Meyer Wilson are a group of lawyers who spend all day, every day, chasing bad stockbrokers and financial advisors across the country who lie, cheat, and steal from their clients. The goal at Meyer Wilson is really twofold. We educate and we advocate. We educate by speaking to individual investors, investor groups, and all kinds of folks, do seminars. We don't charge for this. We do it all over, and we educate folks on what to look for before they hire an investment advisor, a financial advisor. Some red flags. What do we do to limit the exposure to being a victim of investment fraud? And also, in addition to education, we advocate. We are investment fraud lawyers. We are hired by individuals from across the country who are victims of investment fraud. We chase bad brokers. Most financial brokers, financial advisors are honest. We chase the ones who are not. We're contingency fee lawyers. We get paid not on our effort, but on our results. So if you've lost money, or someone you've loved or cared for has lost money at the hands of an unscrupulous broker, we are the lawyers at Meyer Wilson that represent individual investors against their brokers. So again, the radio show, the purpose here is to shine light on investment fraud and how it affects mainstream America, individual investors, and to make sure that you have a voice to speak out and be heard and understand what you can do to minimize the chance of becoming a victim of investment fraud, and what to do if you have become a victim of investment fraud, and how to recover your losses. So if you can't catch the entire show, we do put the show on our website on Monday morning. Our website is www.investorclaims.com. That's investorclaims.com. Every Monday morning, we have a link to our radio show on our website. It's hard to believe that it's been nearly 10 years since the massive financial crisis that wreaked havoc on retirement savings of millions of Americans across the country. 2007, 2008, in the middle of the Great Recession, so probably the last 2 quarters of 2008. Losses to 401ks and IRAs exceeded almost $2 trillion. That's not just made up money. That's not loss of productivity. That is $2 trillion of Main Street America's retirement savings in 401ks and IRAs and investments that was lost as a result of the Great Recession. Now we fast forward nearly 10 years and things have improved dramatically. Markets have recovered and they're at nearly all-time highs. But what we cannot do is let our guards down and forget the dangers of Wall Street greed and the fraud and the damage that it can cause to individual investors and their retirement savings. So what's the best way to learn about what happened, to educate and become informed so we can not repeat the mistakes, not become victims again of Wall Street fraud and Wall Street greed? Well, the best way to educate, I found, is to be entertained. And there's a great movie that focuses on the crisis of 2008, the Great Recession. It's called The Big Short. It's been out a couple years. It was out in 2015. It's a biographical drama. It's also a comedy. It is a fantastic movie. We're going to talk about it. It's based on the 2010 book, The Big Short by Michael Lewis. It's about the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, which was triggered by the U.S. housing bubble. And in the movie, hedge fund managers make a fortune by taking advantage of the impending economic collapse in America. It highlights the bottom of the barrel of human behavior that led to the biggest financial collapse since the Great Depression. The movie's smart, it's funny, and it's often tragic at times. And it's not something that's only for Wall Street. You don't have to be a Wall Street regular to understand it, to watch it. It's made for everyday America. It's a little bit of a comedy, and it uses some really creative filmmaking and narrative to make complicated financial on high-risk subprime loans. And everyone probably remembers what was going on with subprime loans, but folks were borrowing money, unbelievable amounts of money for homes that they couldn't afford. Folks that are making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 were buying $500,000 homes with no money down. And those loans were being made available because of the demand from Wall Street. Wall Street was making these loans available by packaging them up, selling them as investments in products like CMOs and CDOs. And this movie does a really, really good job about breaking it down so you can understand what was going on. But and they actually go to middle America and talk to folks, barbers, hairdressers, middle America that were the targets of these loans. So mortgage brokers that were making a fortune. I mean, these 20, 22, 25-year-old mortgage brokers were making hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars selling these subprime mortgages to unsuspecting victims. And they were able to do that because the supply was being jammed down their throat by Wall Street, because Wall Street was sophisticated enough to be able to design products that they could sell to investors to make these loans available. So Mr. Burry is a hedge fund manager, and a hedge fund is an investment fund that pulls money from generally sophisticated investors and invest in different asset classes. And generally a hedge fund is going to invest in sophisticated, complicated investment assets that are riskier and that typically everyday America shouldn't invest in. But Michael Burry saw, he foreshadowed in his mind what was going to be a collapse, because he saw an increase in folks not paying, defaults. The default rate during this time period in these subprime loans was increasing, but Wall Street was blind to it. They were making so much money selling these subprime loans, packaging them up and selling them as investments, that nobody was paying attention to the incredible rise in defaults. But Mr. Burry and several other hedge fund managers were on the front end of that. And in 2007, he wanted to take advantage of that. So he created what was called a credit default swap market. And these are complicated financial instruments, but this movie does a really, really good job of explaining it to him. So he was part of a crowd that created this market, and it allowed him to bet against these market-backed, mortgage-backed securities. So he's basically selling short. He was betting that the subprime market, that the housing market would collapse. So he created an investment vehicle that would allow him to profit and invest to sell short this housing market. In the event that the housing market collapsed, he would make money. So he proposed this idea to several major investment and commercial banks, and they were all over it, because in order for him to make this bet, he had to pay large, very large monthly premiums. I mean, his bet was, I think, over $1 billion. So the banks, on one end, they're making money packaging and creating these sophisticated products made up, bundling these subprime mortgages and selling them to investors. So they're making a ton of money on that side. And then Burry is paying them to basically continue to make the bets they were making. So they were making money on both sides. So he bet about $1 billion of his hedge fund money, and he was paying substantial premiums to the bank. And what he discovered was that these banks were colluding with major bond rating companies to maintain high ratings on these bonds. So that when these products were packaged together, they were rubber stamped with top ratings, AAA ratings, A ratings from these bond rating companies, and that gave these products the wherewithal and the rubber stamp of the bonding rating companies to go out and sell them. And they were just making money back and forth, total conflicts of interest. The rating companies weren't really doing their job. They were just essentially rubber stamping these sophisticated bundling of products, giving it their top rating, and then the investment banks would sell these products. But eventually, Michael Burry and a couple others in the movie that they highlight were right. The housing market obviously did collapse, and Burry's fund value increased by something like 500%. His fund made over $2 billion. $2 billion. So again, how does this affecting mainstream America? Well, obviously, for all the folks that got sucked in to buying a house that they couldn't afford, were stuck with mortgages that had artificially deflated interest rates, variable interest rates that obviously increased after a certain amount of time. But most folks didn't understand that. They go to a professional, a mortgage banker, a mortgage broker, and they give some information, and they're told that they can afford an X $100,000 house, and they do it. And at the time, before this, there are guidelines that in order to be able to borrow money, you have to be able to demonstrate that you have the ability to pay it back. You shouldn't be able to borrow $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 if you can't demonstrate that you have the income and assets sufficient to be able to pay it back. But that wasn't going on. When this bubble was blowing up and increasing, and the demand was increasing in early to mid 2000s before the bubble burst, folks were getting loans that they couldn't afford. It's because they were feeding the Wall Street machine. This mortgage brokers, the mortgage industry was feeding this Wall Street machine. I mean, they could not loan money fast enough, and ultimately that blew up. So, but that was the demand. The demand was created by Wall Street in creating these sophisticated bundling of products that ultimately destroyed a lot of these homeowners, and it was artificially increasing the value of the homes, of course, and that all collapsed. So there's damage all over the place, right? We've got folks in homes at that point that were worth way less than they paid for them. Their mortgage balance far exceeding the value. They're totally underwater. Repossessions were at all-time high, still going on. So we also have damage, tremendous amount of damage, to the individual investor who was invested in any type of investment vehicles that had these mortgage-backed securities in them. So that's why there was such a decline in the stock market and folks' retirement and 401k. So that's 10 years ago. Markets have recovered, and the markets are nearly, an all-time high. So we're going to take a break here in a minute. When we come back, we're going to talk about what are some takeaways. What can mainstream America, individual investors who have money in 401ks, retirements, savings, folks that are invested in the stock market, what can we learn to protect ourselves from being a victim of Wall Street greed? I am attorney David Meyer with the law firm of Meyer Wilson. You're listening to the radio broadcast and watching too on Facebook Live. Cover your assets. We'll be right back after this break.
I'll clean that up at the end there.
All right.
Where you
have you seen the movie?
I have it. I bought it, but I still have yet to watch it. So I hear it's awesome.
It really is a good movie.
The book is fascinating.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I heard it was actually pretty awesome, so I have yet to watch it.
The way it really is a comedy, and the way that they are able to explain these really complicated financial instruments in a way that
For dummies like me.
well, all of us
Well,
that can
literally it is. It's
that can
like
understand
Margot Robbie in a bathtub talking about what a CDO is and AAA. You know what I mean? It's you can understand it. The book you have to really sometimes reread it if you have no idea what they are. The tranches.
Well, and you have to know how to read. So
Well, that's the key to almost.
You can just watch a movie,
Yeah.
get some popcorn and watch.
that's what I did in high school. I mean,
Hey,
just watch the movie.
All right, we ready?
Ready.
Welcome back to the show. I am attorney David Meyer. You're listening to the radio broadcast of Cover Your Assets. Again, attorney David Meyer with the law firm of Meyer Wilson. Cover Your Assets. Meyer Wilson is an investment fraud law firm representing individual investors who have claims against their brokerage firms. We represent individuals across the country. We have offices in California, Michigan, and Ohio. Before the break, we're talking about the movie The Big Short, a very popular movie. Came out in 2015, highlighting the Great Recession, the housing bubble, and the effects of Wall Street greed and fraud and how it impacts everyday America. It impacted homeowners who were sold a bill of goods with these subprime mortgages and ended up, many of them, unfortunately, in default, could not sustain the monthly payments when the variable interest rate rose. They're stuck in houses that were worth far less than what they paid and far less than the mortgages. And it also devastated the investment accounts of millions of Americans by cutting into the value of their retirement accounts, their 401ks. And 10 years has passed, and now we want to talk about what can we take away from the movie? What can we take away from what happened then in the Great Recession so we can avoid or reduce our chances of falling into that hole again? So a couple lessons learned, and this is part of what I do, part of our educational efforts at the law firm of Meyer Wilson, is talking to groups, retirement groups, business groups, individual investors, retirees, about what they can do to protect themselves from becoming a victim of investment fraud. Investment fraud costs billions of dollars of actual losses a year, and there are things that we can do to minimize the chance of becoming a victim. And the first thing, we can look under the hood. So before hiring anybody, before signing any agreements to buy an investment, whether it's an annuity, a private placement, signing on with a brokerage firm, any of that, you need to make sure you understand what you're signing. Just like folks that bought these mortgages, these subprime mortgages, didn't really understand what they were signing. They didn't understand that the interest rates initially were artificially low and that they would increase. So spend some time before you sign to know what you're buying, before you buy that annuity that your broker wants to sell you, before you buy that variable life insurance product that your advisor wants to sell you. Make sure you understand it. And, I've cross-examined many stockbrokers and managers, branch managers and compliance officers in FINRA arbitration, which is the forum that is required to pursue any disputes against your broker. I've cross-examined many brokers on cases of variable annuity sales practice violations where my investor client was sold a variable annuity that was inappropriate for him or her and that caused substantial financial losses. And when I cross-examine the broker and I have the annuity contract that's often 75, 100 pages, it's an 8-point font that's very hard to read, and I go through that contract of the annuity with the broker, oftentimes the broker has not even read it. The broker who is selling these products to their clients has not even read, oftentimes, the details behind the product they're selling. What they know, what they see, is a PowerPoint presentation from a wholesaler that highlights in 5 slides or less how great these products are, and guess what? How much commissions are paid when the products are sold. But not everybody, but a lot of these advisors don't even understand what they're selling. So if the broker doesn't understand, or the branch manager, the compliance officer often don't understand what they're selling. What do you think the customer is supposed to do? So, and my advice is, if you can't understand it, if you can't explain back to the advisor what you're buying and what the benefits are and what the risks are, then you shouldn't buy it. A lot of folks who bought investment products that were put together by Wall Street during the housing bubble, whether they were CMOs or CDOs, these are things you can learn about by watching the movie The Big Short. But a lot of these investment vehicles that were sold that were part of the housing bubble were very complicated, extremely sophisticated, and nobody understood what they were. And so my first piece of advice to minimize the chance that you'll ever get sucked into one of these bad investments is to make sure you understand. You don't need to understand every detail. And I know this stuff is complicated, but we're dealing with your life savings. And there are investment vehicles that are appropriate for 95% of us that are straightforward. A decent mix of stocks and bonds, mutual funds. These are not complicated ETFs. These are mainstream products that are easier to understand and that are what most of us ought to have in our retirement accounts. Most of us don't need these complicated, sophisticated products. If it's sophisticated and complicated so much that you can't understand it, just skip it. It's not worth it. And a lot of folks would have saved a lot of their hard-earned money had they not got tangled up with some of these sophisticated products back before the Great Recession. The next point of advice is be careful about who you're getting advice from. Be careful about who you are entrusting with your life savings. We place a high level of trust in people who claim to have expertise in areas we're not comfortable in. We go to our doctors do an evaluation, they give us a pill, they give us a diagnosis, and generally speaking, because they're trained, they're the experts, we take their advice. We do the same thing with our accountant. We do the same thing in a lot of different areas in our life because life is complicated. But in this business, since we're dealing with money that you are saving for your financial future, for your retirement, for your kids' education, be very, very careful about who you listen to. And the next one is just do your homework. Spend a little bit of time on the front end before you make these decisions. Ask some questions. Question everything. And if the person on the other end is uncomfortable with your questions, that's a red flag. And that's the same thing when you're hiring a lawyer. If you need an investment fraud lawyer to help recover your losses caused by investment misconduct, you need to speak to an experienced securities fraud lawyer, and you need to ask questions. How long have you been doing this? How many cases have you handled? What kind of firms have you gone against? Those are questions you need to ask your lawyer. And before you hire an investment advisor or a stockbroker, you need to ask some questions. We'll talk about a few of those questions in a minute. But that's what's most important. And you know, the one lesson I learned after watching this movie and being in the trenches, having represented 1,000 individual investors, our law firm has recovered over $350 million for our clients. And I lived through this Great Recession as an investor, as a lawyer, as a citizen. And you know what the most amazing thing to me was? Nobody went to jail. Virtually nobody went to jail for committing this greed and this fraud on behalf of or as victims for what happened in this country. There were crimes committed. There was fraud between the investment companies and the rating companies. And you know, you look at mainstream America. Unfortunately, the Ponzi schemers who steal $100,000 from an elderly woman, those folks go to jail, as they should. But it doesn't seem to be equal treatment for Wall Street. We have a couple minutes. I want to finish just with a couple things you should do before you hire anybody to invest your money. We talked about doing your homework. So here's what you can do. Research a prospective stockbroker or investment advisor before you hire them. You can do this online from in your bathrobe from your own home. You don't need to go anywhere to check up and do a background check on your broker or advisor. You can go to brokercheck.org. That is run by FINRA. That's the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Those are the regulators that regulate the securities industry. Go to www.brokercheck.org. Type the name and the firm of your broker, and you can pull up what's called a CRD report. It's not 100% accurate, but it's much better than having nothing. And that will list the exams that your prospective advisor has taken and passed, any disciplinary history, any complaints by customers, any regulatory fines or sanctions, if they've been barred from the industry. Obviously, never invest any money with anyone who has a really poor regulatory history. Certainly never invest with anyone who has been barred from the securities industry. Never invest with an unregistered advisor. So many of the folks that call my office who have been victimized by a bad advisor have invested with somebody who wasn't registered. A lot of folks run around and claim that they can invest your money under an exemption under the SEC rules that allow them to invest without being licensed. That exemption is so narrow, you should assume it never applies. Finally, before we're done, my final piece of advice is make sure you work with an advisor who's affiliated with a large financial institution. So if unfortunately something happens and you lose money, you're not stuck just chasing that individual. You have a firm that a lawyer like me can pursue, and if we prove the wrongdoing and we prove damages, there's a firm who has the financial wherewithal to pay a judgment. Do not ever work with somebody who's not affiliated with a firm that'll be around in case the broker runs away with your money. That's all the time we have for our show today. I hope you learned something. I hope you go out and watch The Big Short so you can be an informed investor. I'm attorney David Meyer with the law firm of Meyer Wilson, and you've been listening to Cover Your Assets.